Hi, my name is Carol, and I'm the co-founder of Oak City Labs Software Development Agency. And this is Jay. He's also a co-founder of Oak City Labs. And when developing software, you make a lot of really big decisions, but choosing your open source license is up there as one of the most important decisions you're going to make during the development process. So today we're going to talk about open source licenses. What are they? Why you should care, and which one will be the best fit for your project when it comes to commercialization. So let's dive in. All right, so Jay, you are my go-to resource when it comes to things like this. So first, let's cover the basics. So what is an open source license?
An open source license is a software license for your open source software, and that tells you how it can be used and what are the rules that govern like how you use it.
And so like how is open source software used in projects typically?
Well, there's a lot of times you see like libraries and frameworks that are open source that you might want to use in a software application. Basically the licensing for those comes down to two different kinds. There's like a permissive licensing and a more restrictive licensing. Just to divide them into two big groups. The more restrictive licensing will say that if you use an open source project in your application, that you have to open source the whole application. The GPL is the main one that you'll see with those restrictions. So that's a concern people have when they use open source software in a commercial closed source application. Can I use this library, this other piece of code in my application and still be able to like sell it commercially without giving up all the source code?
Okay. And so you kind of mentioned one GPL is mentioned a lot. So what are some of the top open source licenses people might hear out there today?
So there's the GPL, which is probably the most restrictive one, or at least the most popular popular one. And then other ones you might hear are the MIT license and the BSD license, and those are much more permissive. Those are more basically like, here, take the software, you can use it in your closed source thing. And then there's some details about, well, if you make changes to that library, then you need to open source those maybe, but you can still have a closed source application that you sell, including these open source libraries under the MIT and the BSD license. Apache is another one of those more permissive licenses.
Okay, so like if you're evaluating a project, like an open source framework to use in your software application, and I'm just summarizing, then if you see GPL, you might want to like stop for a minute and definitely reconsider that one. Is that right?
Yeah, and it depends. The GPL, this is where you want to check with like, a lawyer and stuff, because the GPL has some very specific limitations. Like if you're using a GPL application as part of your software and it talks to other pieces like over the network, then maybe that's okay. But the GPL is definitely something you want to sort of stop and take a harder look at and see if that's really something that's going to work for whatever model you're distributing. Another sort of weird thing about the GPL is the GPL itself, they're variations that close this loophole, but the GPL says that you only have to open source things that you distribute. So if you're a big company building something internally, maybe that's okay because you can use it internally without having to distribute source code.
Okay. And what about projects where they're open source, but you still have to buy like a license to use them? I know we're working on a project right now, I think, where we've got an open source project, but you still have to pay to use it. Is that typically like GPL or is that something else?
Usually the open source, the thing we're using, there's an open source version, and then there's sort of this pro version that has some extra features. And those are actually usually licensed with two different licenses. Like the open source one might be GPL or BSD or something, but the commercial one, which usually includes extra pieces, is licensed under some closed source thing. Because they have this open source thing, I guess it's probably not a strictly GPL, because then the whole thing would have to be open source. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but those upgraded ones are usually a different custom license.
Gotcha. And probably, I don't know if this is right or not, but one of the most popular examples or structures that come to mind is Red Hat. I
Mhm.
think it's built on open source, but you can buy an enterprise version of Red Hat.
Yeah, and they started out, that's another thing to think about when you're looking at GPL software. Like Red Hat especially started out saying, here's the operating system, we packaged it and all that for free, and they really built their business on a services model early on, where they help people integrate that and get it deployed and things like that. And they've since grown their empire and all sorts of things, but that's how they got started.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So based on that, which one would you say is the best for commercialization?
Like if you're looking at
Mhm.
open source you want to include,
Yeah.
probably the most straightforward one is like the MIT license. We have a couple of open source things, and they're distributed under MIT. Oak City Lab does, and that's basically says, here's some software, you can do with it what you want. If it breaks, you get to keep the pieces. But there's no, and maybe there might be a clause about attribution where you just have to say where you got it from. But that's really the most permissive. You can do anything with this, so there's no restrictions based on that. And like the things we have out there under open source, we're happy for folks to use. And like a lot of other open source projects, it's out there because we hope it's useful for somebody, but building applications and things like that is not super straightforward. So just because somebody has access to the source doesn't mean they can build an application out of it. And we would be happy to help them do that.
Very cool. All right. So that's a little bit about open source licensing and what to watch for. So as always, thank you for watching. And if you have any questions about open source licenses, please drop them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more tech tips. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Carol.